Hi, my name is Anna Paula Mumi, and I've been a certified and licensed speech-language pathologist for 15 years. Today I want to talk about something I've entitled Talking Without Shame for People Who Stutter. I want to share with you two very personal experiences that will guide this brief talk, and my hope is that I'll be able to touch a heart or lift the spirits of a person who stutters or a parent or family member of a person who stutters. 6.5 years ago, my husband and I welcomed our first child. She was a long-awaited baby, a miracle really, because we were told at one point in our marriage that it was very unlikely we would ever have natural children. When she was 10 months old, to our utter surprise, I found out I was pregnant again, and nearly 5 years ago, we welcomed our son. I truly love being a mom, and my children bring so much joy to our lives. When my son was about 3.5 years old, he began to stutter. I noticed it gradually got worse, and for a period of about 4 to 5 months, it was a very evident and constant part of his regular conversations. I immediately thought through risk factors and realized that a few were true for him. He was a male, his disfluencies were primarily part word repetitions, and he had several sound errors in his speech. We're also a bilingual family, so that added an extra component in our linguistic environment. Initially, I experienced shock. When your work is helping individuals with communication disorders, you just don't expect to face that challenge in your own home. When it persisted, I experienced fear that others would notice and bring attention to it and cause him to become uneasy about it, or that play buddies would say unkind words to him or make fun of him. I also experienced anger when I heard a well-meaning family member say to him impatiently, "Just say it," one particular instance when he was struggling to get his words out. I even experienced a little embarrassment, thinking to myself, what will people think? I was surprised at my strong wave of emotion surrounding his stutter in a relatively short amount of time. I began to read and reread articles on stuttering. I watched lots of videos of adults, children, and parents of persons who stutter, and I unburied shelved resources on stuttering. I know that a large majority of preschool children who stutter do outgrow it, but as a parent, I was still concerned. As a speech-language pathologist, I've always tried to convey to parents that what children are communicating, regardless of their diagnosis, is far more important than how they communicate it, and that who they are inside is far more invaluable than any outward challenges. In other words, we seek to value and see the person, not the disorder. I've come to realize that this is an easy thing to say when it's not your child. I remember approaching our van in a parking lot one afternoon, feeling teary, overwhelmed, and helpless after hearing my son significantly struggle to communicate fluently. I looked at his sweet face with despair and thought, what if he doesn't outgrow this? And in that moment, I realized the truth of what I've preached to parents for many years, that the who is what matters. I thought to myself, if the stuttering persists, my son is still the same cuddly, sensitive, funny, smart, and active little boy I love. He's still a gift I'm privileged to enjoy every day. He's still the one who follows me around the house and says for no apparent reason at the most random times, "Mama, I love you so much." In that moment, I resolved in my heart that even if he continued to stutter, he would know he's loved, he's special, and that what he has to say is important to us. With that in mind, I began to think through and plan out, in a sense, how I would express his value to us more tangibly through my actions and my words, as well as the importance of his thoughts and spoken messages. I knew that if he did not recover, as many preschoolers do, stuttering would surely shape his life experiences and his self-concept. The one common thread I perceived from my own reactions and from listening to others talk about life with stuttering was feelings of guilt and shame. So I began to ponder what I would say to him, how I would encourage him, and how I would give him the freedom, if you will, to be a person who stutters. Interestingly enough, After making some environmental changes at home, like practicing turn taking, lessening disruptions and interruptions in our home, he showed significant improvement. I also noticed that some of the periods of more noticeable disfluencies were tied to language bursts, where he was gaining a lot of vocabulary at once, especially because he's growing up bilingual. He's still not out of the woods, as his stuttering still seems to fluctuate at varying degrees. So in the midst of my pensive planning, it prompted me to consider, what would I say to my son? Stuttering will surely affect his educational experience, his career choice, his friendships, his marriage. So I kept thinking, what would be the affirmation he would need to hear from me and from himself one day so that he would become the best communicator he could be? How would I affirm that I value him and his message? And thus, Talking Without Shame for Persons Who Stutter was born. When it comes to speech and language disorders, I've come to realize that in my 15 years of working with children and parents, stuttering is probably one of the most emotionally charged disorders I have encountered. In other words, there's usually a lot of strong emotions surrounding it, and most parents, when they bring their child in for treatment, they have an expectation that it be gone. There are also a lot of misconceptions surrounding stuttering, for example, that it signifies lower intelligence, immaturity, or even defiance. And one very real and intense emotion that is usually present is shame. So I've recently become intrigued by the work of researcher Dr. Brené Brown. She has spent years studying shame, and she defines it as, quote, the intensely painful feeling that we are unworthy of love and belonging. As I have read articles and watched dozens of interviews about the experiences of people who stutter, the common thread for many of them is that very feeling of unworthiness and lack of acceptance or belonging. Dr. Brown describes shame as being deadly and something that will, quote, creep into every corner and crevice of your life. For persons who stutter, this is crippling, and it appears to intensify the stuttering and hinder sustainable progress even during treatment. So my belief is that if we as speech-language professionals address it first, it sets the foundation for everything else that follows. In other words, shame is a key component that must be addressed early on for people who stutter. Another point Dr. Brown makes is that, quote, shame cannot survive empathy because shame depends on me buying into the belief that I'm alone. Dr. Brown also talks about the fear of disconnection, and she poses the question, is there something about me that if other people know it or see it, that I won't be worthy of connection? So you might be thinking to yourself, is shame really that powerful? Can shame really cripple or hinder a person's future or a person's ability to lead a normal life? This leads me to the second very personal experience I want to share today about shame in my own life. I immigrated to the U.S. with my family when I was nearly 11 years old, and because my siblings and I learned English very quickly and my parents lagged behind, there was a role reversal in our home. We became the interpreters, the translators, and as teenagers, we all worked to help support our family. When adult-child roles shift in a home, it creates some chaos and confusion, and I became very insecure about myself. I'm also one of 10 children, so oftentimes I felt I had to compete for approval and acceptance, and I compared myself a lot with my siblings in a non-productive way. I think subconsciously I was always trying to measure up, but I always felt inadequate. This led me to make some very foolish choices from the time I was 16 to the time I was about 21 or 22, as I longed for and sought out acceptance and belonging. I was somewhat of a mess inside, although from the outside, you would not have known this. I was very studious, hardworking, responsible. I obtained a bachelor's degree in 3.5 years, my master's in 2 years, so from the outside, I appeared pretty well-rounded. At 23 years of age, through both maturing and good counsel, I finally dealt with my insecurities in productive ways, but I carried the residue of shame over those years. I eventually met the man who is now my husband, and we walked out a beautiful courtship. Our relationship was very different than previous relationships we had had. And after our engagement, at one point in our marriage counseling, it was recommended that we sit down at some point and discuss anything in our past that needed to be shared. He was not suggesting that we air out dirty laundry indiscriminately, but instead his advice was that we conscientiously think through what needed to be shared so that we would begin our marriage with a foundation of honesty and transparency before each other. It was great advice, but very difficult to carry out, as you might imagine. And so for me, it was several weeks of excruciating stress and fear of what my fiance would think of me when he realized who I once was. Now, granted, my fiance had a past just like me. He dealt with insecurities and feelings of rejection for various reasons. He came from a broken family. He was also born with a cleft lip and was bullied because of it as a child. So it's not that I thought that he would not be able to relate to my past, but there were specific things that I knew I needed to tell him. I agonized over how I would tell him, and my biggest fear was that somehow he would look at me differently, that he would not love me or accept me in the way that I hoped he would. So the day came when we decided to have our talk, and through much fear and trepidation, I got the words out. Let me also clarify that my fiance had no idea what I was dealing with in the weeks preceding that discussion, and I hadn't said anything to him about how I was feeling. After spilling my heart out before him, he looked at me with compassion and spoke the very opposite of what I imagined he would say. He met me with kindness and empathy without an ounce of judgment, and it literally changed my life. In that moment, I was fully known, yet fully loved and accepted, and every ounce of fear and shame literally vanished. And it set the foundation for the beginning of our lives together. As Dr. Brown stated, shame cannot survive empathy. So for me, my shame began with wrong thinking that led to wrong decisions and choices that led to consequences that led to shame. Now, if you're a person who stutters watching this, shame doesn't come because of something you've done wrong, although you might perceive that not speaking fluently makes you wrong. The feelings of shame that you might feel probably result from how you perceive that people will perceive you. It's probably rooted in the fact that you might feel less worthy of love and acceptance, or less worthy of connection, or that you don't belong because of it. I can tell you that you're not alone. There are millions in the U.S. alone who share your experience, my son's experience of stuttering. So let me share with you another insight from Dr. Brown, which certainly played out in my own life. And that is that, quote, in order for connection to happen, we have to allow ourselves to be seen. So at the core of being seen for who we are, there are 3 statements I want to leave you with, which is the premise of talking without shame for persons who stutter. First, talk freely, because your voice should be heard. Secondly, talk fearlessly, because your thoughts are important. And finally, talk confidently, because your message matters. In a nutshell, what I want to communicate to you is, don't stop talking. You can talk without fear or shame because you're worthy of love and a connection. There's nothing about stuttering that changes that. That's what's become so vivid in my mind about my own son. The stuttering doesn't change who he is. It doesn't change how much he's loved or how much we treasure his little life that's blooming. So please hear me say, you are important and your thoughts matter. Your message matters with or without the stuttering. In the last year, I've read about and I've met some really amazing and inspiring people who stutter. What's wonderful about people who stutter, who are confident about themselves, is that they can then educate the majority of people who don't understand it, who still hold misconceptions about it. And when we educate ourselves and others, we all grow. The reality is that we are all imperfect in one way or another, but even with our flaws, we are worthy of love and belonging. And if those imperfections present us challenges or take away our confidence or our joy, we can overcome the shame that accompanies those imperfections if we're first honest with ourselves and others who love us and care about us. So be encouraged today. If you're a person who stutters or a family member, I'd love to hear from you. You may contact me via my website at thespeechstop.com. Thank you so much for watching today.